Hi, my name is Dr. Barbara Amir, and I'm a pharmacist, a clinical pharmacologist, and I'm affiliated with Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School as an adjunct associate professor of medicine. I've been asked to speak today on obesity and weight management, role of nutrition and therapies. This is our outline. I'll start with definitions, prevalence of obesity and overweight, aspects of the disease of obesity and its development, hormones, genetics, and epigenetics, environment and physical activity, health risks with overweight and obesity, clinical management, including goals and strategies, eating patterns, physical activity, drugs, and bariatric surgery, and finally a few closing word on obesity and overweight in children and adolescents. Here are some critical thinking questions from Cengage. I'm not going to be discussing these, but you can keep these in mind as you hear this presentation and as you read the associated materials. How can you modify an obesogenic environment? In an overweight individual, how does the presence of risk factors potentiate development of chronic disease? In an overweight or obese individual, describe diet planning methods that would help to increase weight loss. Some overweight or obese individuals hope for spot reducing, which is losing weight in certain areas of the body. Based on your understanding of metabolism, is this a realistic goal? For the average individual, why is it hard to define weight loss accomplishments, that is, progress or lack thereof, towards an individual goal? And finally, how does being underweight affect health? What factors would contribute to an individual being underweight? First, I'd like to start with a quote from the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. In an article on obesity and outcomes in COVID-19, the author writes, "Maintaining body weight and remaining fit are crucial goals for possible future pandemics." This is a word to the wise. When we think about the needs that we will be facing going forward with obesity, we can add on to what already exists and the number of people in the U.S. who are trying to lose weight. 2 out of 3 adults each year try to lose weight, and they only have small success. The obesity epidemic, and it is truly an epidemic globally, is worsening, and that was before the pandemic. It affects certain groups more than others: women, the poor, blacks, and Hispanics, as well as children and adolescents. In the United States, we define obesity based on body mass index, the BMI. And for adults, that definition for overweight is in the 25 to 29 range. 30 to 39 is in the category of obesity, and 40 being severe obesity. Children, however, based on their percentile, based on age and the gender-based growth charts, and you'll see examples of these in this presentation. It is clearly a major health problem with consequences, not only in the United States, but here's some information from the country of Japan. So the health ministry is very concerned about the economic fallout of having a population with obesity because of its many comorbidities that cost the country a lot of money. They've always been concerned about their economy since World War II. So they have, the Ministry of Health in Japan actually has a different BMI threshold. It is not 30 but 25 because of the smaller body size of the average Japanese person. And using that definition, there are 30% of adults living in Japan over the age of 30 who are obese. This has been attributed to a change in lifestyle. And we see this over several generations, actually. If you look at the graph on the right, you see, for instance, in the city of Tokyo, there was a big change over the last 5 decades in the amount of total fat, which is the solid line and the solid circles, dramatically increasing and steadily increasing and only starting to plateau in the late 90s. You could see it's Japan overall is a little bit lower. That's the solid line without the dots. So it's worse in the cities like Tokyo, and it's probably related to a number of things. The demography, with fewer women in the household, more out in the workforce, so they need to seek faster ways of preparing meals, and probably less healthy ones than the Japanese historically have been known for. Back to the U.S. So we look at these maps of incidence of obesity. This data has been collected for many decades by our Center for Disease Control, and it's collected by them, but it's collected from every county in every state of the United States. There is a color-coded map where the cool colors of blue and purple represent under 20% incidence of obesity, and the warm colors, the warmer and deeper the reds, the higher the incidence. So you could see with this, you could see the time trend from this meticulously collected data in our own country, and that's just through 2010. The trend, unfortunately, has continued to rise. It's estimated that now we have about 70% of adults who are either overweight or obese. And worldwide, it's a problem with 1.9 billion, that's with a B, adults worldwide. This is a time trend for the prevalence of overweight and obesity among children and adolescents aged 2 to 19 in the United States. Data was begun to be collected back in the 1963 to 1965 range, and this graph shows it through 2013 to 2014. Here, the definition of obesity is greater than or equal to the 95th percentile for the child's gender and age, excuse me. So the all is, the trend for all is pretty much continuing to increase. And what is particularly troubling, and that you may not be aware of, I was certainly surprised when I learned this, when I was doing this research back a few years, that even in the 2 to 5 year old age range, we have toddlers meeting the definition of obesity. If you are interested in this and related material, I have it in this paper that I published on pediatric obesity, and the reference is there. It is freely available. So why is this? What are the factors that lead to childhood obesity? Well, is it genetics? Is it environmental? Is it both? Some of the factors that have pretty much been established now is that if a parent is obese, it increases the likelihood that their child is obese. We know that it's influenced strongly by diet and physical activity. Now, whether that's also related to television is controversial. It seems to be more like what is done, like how much is eaten during an activity like watching a monitor. as in this photograph. Eating out is a factor. We mentioned parents, influence of parents. They're also role models. We can't forget that. And then the added sugars that are commonplace in our diet, that are advertised heavily, and that are difficult to avoid. So I mentioned there's categories of obesity, and the severe obesity is largely defined in the following way. Either a BMI greater than or equal to 35, which is the criteria, and close to what it is for being obese, severe obesity in adults, or over 120% of the 95th percentile for the BMI for age. As that graph showed, severe obesity is actually the fastest growing subgroup, comprising nearly 6% of all youth in the United States. And it is valuable to look at the ethnicities because there's patterns here that persist to this day. This happens to be from that 2013 to 2014 data collection. And if you look at the middle row, non-Hispanic Asians have, the lowest obesity rate and this is when they live in the United States, of course, if they're Asian girls, 5%. Whereas it increases in boys in that same group. It's much higher in blacks, as you can see the line above, as well as non-Hispanic whites. But probably the hardest hit one is the Hispanic and even more so Mexican Americans. Well, some people were shocked in 2013 when two major medical organizations declared obesity as a disease. And they felt it was a disease because it met the criteria of a disease, namely, normal body functions are affected, there are clinical signs and symptoms, and clearly can cause harm, which is known as morbidity. And this material is pretty standard information, and it's worth going over. You may have heard it before, but it's worth repeating. Energy in is greater than energy out is called positive energy balance. Where does the energy go? It's stored. Where? In adipose tissue, that's fat tissue, and fat cells or adipocytes. Now, as you'll see in the next graphic, the number and size of the fat cells increase as there's positive energy balance over long periods of time. The cells proliferate. They actually grow and multiply to a point. What we'd like to have is energy out exceeding energy in, so we can lose weight in these examples. And we'll see on the next slide what happens to the fat, which are represented by these yellow circles. Now, the beginning part is normal development in an individual over their lifespan. Fat cells grow just like every other cell grows during development. But when energy in exceeds energy out over a long period of time, each of the cells, as you can see in the third and the fourth picture, they increase in size. After they proliferate, which means they increase in number, then they stop, but then they increase in size. If there is weight loss that you see in the last picture, the number of cells unfortunately never decrease, only their size shrinks. An important factor is what's called ectopic adiposity, where there's fat deposits. That's what ectopic means. It's someplace where it's not supposed to be. And there's fat deposits, and maybe the heart, for instance, the liver, the pancreas. All of these we know now, they impair health. So even when somebody's BMI isn't in what the cutoffs are, if they have excessive adiposity at ectopic sites, they could have impaired health. So obesity is being called by some in the field of bariatric medicine, a new discipline within medicine, adiposity-based chronic disease. Adiposity-based meaning it's the obesity is the basis of the disease. It is clearly a chronic disease, and it's almost like a syndrome, although doesn't meet the definition of a syndrome, but many different parts of the body can be affected. As you see in this table, this is also from the review article that I wrote and that you can access if you wish. And this is a continuation of this long list of what we call weight-related disease, sometimes called comorbidities. They happen with obesity. So now we're going to turn to fat cell metabolism and say a few words about that. And we'll begin with an enzyme. The name of that enzyme is lipoprotein lipase. It's really fascinating. It's the subject of a lot of research now. We know that it contributes to normal metabolism of lipoproteins. It helps deliver the fats that are broken down to specific tissues, and it affects how it's utilized in the body as an energy source. And it really affects energy balance, insulin action, body weight, and atherosclerosis. So there's more of this enzyme, lipoprotein lipase, abbreviated LPL, in the fat cells of individuals with obesity compared to people who have normal body weight. It also depends on gender, and with men having more of the enzyme in abdomen, fat cells in the abdominal area, whereas women have more LPL levels in breast, thigh, and hips. Now, this can be an explanation for why it is hard for an individual to spot reduce their fat because it's this enzyme is working against them because the enzyme wants to deposit the triglyceride breakdown products in these specific areas of the body. This ties into what's called the set point theory of body weight regulation. So the thought is that the brain is thinking like a thermostat, that it's set at a certain weight, and it likes that weight, and it wants to stay at that weight. And if you lose weight, it just sneaks back up to that set point. And that's a really critical aspect of the yo-yoing of body weight of people who periodically go on diets. They go off the diet, their weight goes up, they go back on a diet. It's very hard because every time the weight goes up, that new set point is set at a higher number. So what about genetics? Do they play a role? Well, to some extent, genetics plays a role in almost any disease. But we know it's not an easy answer because it's complex. There's environmental factors, other physiologic factors, and of course psychological influences. We can say that genetics may predispose somebody to obesity, but it's going to depend on what's their diet and how much physical activity and what kind of physical activity. There is an obesity gene, that gene named OB in italic font that you see at the bottom. And one of the things that we know it does is it gives directions to the body to synthesize a protein called leptin. Leptin is a hormone, or a hormone-like, in the part of the brain called the hypothalamus. It promotes negative energy balance, so that's good, right? It suppresses appetite and it increases energy expenditure. Now, in studies of this leptin hormone has been studied for decades now, and you'd think it'd be the magic bullet. Well, it's not. You would have heard about it. There's very, very little clinical use for leptin, although there is an injectable drug, I could tell you as a pharmacologist, that's used in certain people with a true leptin deficiency, but it's very rare. So the part of the experiments, we're going to slide. This is in a mouse model that is bred so that it is obese. It's the obese mouse model. And you see on the left, this is a mouse who was they were left. That's how fat they would get. The one on the right is from that same colony of the obese mouse model, but was given the leptin injectable treatment that I told you about. And while the mouse lost weight, it still weighs 1.5 times as much as a normal mouse. So you see, it clearly, this experiment shows it plays a role, but leptin is not a magic. So I mentioned is mutation of the leptin or the gene that would affect leptin is very, very rare. But there is something that is more common, and it's being called leptin resistance. And they think that it's induced by high fructose containing beverages. Remember the leptin has the effect of increasing energy expenditure, suppressing the appetite. Well, if your body has leptin, it has a normal amount of leptin if you measured it, but it's not working. It's as if it doesn't see it. It's there, but it doesn't see it. That's called leptin resistance. So it would be similar to a deficiency. And I think of this analogy to insulin in people with diabetes, that there's, in the early stages of type 2 diabetes, there's insulin resistance, where there's lots of insulin, in fact, too much insulin, hyperinsulinemia, and it's not doing its job. Now, opposing leptin is the hormone or hormone-like chemical called ghrelin. Ghrelin is secreted by stomach cells and has the opposite effect. It increases appetite. It promotes positive energy balance. But it does have some roles even beyond this, because we see in studies lack of sleep increases ghrelin and lowers leptin. And that's why it's important to get a sufficient sleep, because it's going to help you not be overweight. So, a few words about fat cell types. We think of brown adipose tissue as that's the one that's predominant in babies, and it changes during the course of human development. That's why in the small font you see adults have very little brown fat, and unfortunately overweight and obese people have even less. Adults have even less. So the biochemistry in the body is that in the brown fat tissue or adipose tissue, oxidation of the brown fat releases energy just as heat. And this is called uncoupling it from ATP, which is the energy source in the body. It uncouples it. White fat, on the other hand, oxidizes it to heat and ATP, and it stores fat for use by other cells. Now, the good news, brown fat is considered the better fat, the more healthy fat. And the good news is that exercise induces what's called browning of the white adipose tissue. And that has another name called beige adipose tissue or bright, BRITE, adipocytes. So that's, now we're going to move to things like environment, and what is an obesogenic environment? Well, we have that in America, unfortunately. It's fairly commonplace for overeating. Becomes a pattern. The abundance, until the pandemic anyway, the abundance of food in America. And unfortunately, serving sizes have been normalized to being extra large in our restaurants and then consequently in our homes. And this is really to our detriment. So it has become an obesogenic environment in the last over the course of the last 5 decades. Another environmental factor that contributes to overweight and obesity is inactivity. And because this is such an important component, it goes hand in hand with diet and nutrition. Physical activity. I felt it was valuable to show you the definitions by the World Health Organization. Physical activity is any bodily movement, like fidgeting even, produced by skeletal muscles that results in energy expenditure. Now, you didn't hear the word exercise there. Exercise is a subcategory of physical activity and is defined by WHO as planned, structured, repeated with a purpose to maintain or increase physical fitness. Because countries are so concerned about the obesity epidemic, they're doing things at a national level. And just a brief word on this from our own U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. They recommend to prevent weight gain 60 minutes of moderate activity, and it's activity, it's not exercise, or doesn't need to be exercise, every day. They've created a website which has videos that are, very consumer friendly. They call their program Move Your Way because they allow the individual to just look at it and pick what they like. And there's the URL. And I'll come back to this later when we talk about clinical management. But to show you the consequences, the seriousness of obesity, why Japan is taking this so seriously, the United States is doing what it can, and it's a very good program, the Move Your Way, but they can't really advertise it the way a for-profit can. Now we look at Canada has this Edmonton staging system for obesity. So they feel, many chronic diseases in medicine are staged to give a common understanding of what to expect and what direction they could be headed towards. So these are progressive, where stage 0, functionally fine, where stage 1, mild symptoms, 2, moderate, 3, severe, and 4, can you believe it, the term end stage. We use that for chronic diseases like kidney failure, end stage kidney disease, needing dialysis and transplant. Where stage 4 is going to definitely be associated with serious disability, poor quality of life. So what about health risk and being overweight? So there's different categories, and this is good to know, that somebody can be overweight but in good health. They may still want to lose weight because they want to lose weight to continue to be in good health. They don't really, they don't have any overweight problem. Another category, obese or overweight, and they have risk factors for, that long list of medical conditions, and you'll see it again in the next slide, where 2 or more risk factors are considered, that's a cause for concern. The third category, well, they're clearly obese or overweight and they have a life-threatening condition, and they must lose weight. Medical conditions, We like to set reasonable goals. And how do you know what a reasonable goal is? Well, here are about 10 different medical conditions for which weight loss is recommended. And you could see the range for this is initial weight loss. It doesn't mean you necessarily stop there. We knew about it for hypertension. You may have heard that you can, if you could actually lose 5% of your body weight, and your mild hypertension could go away. So you can see the ranges are between 5 and 15%. But even more is needed for this non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a very serious condition. Just a quick word about gimmicks and that they're out there because this is a big business, unfortunately, and people get taken advantage of. There are lots of fad diets, but there's some good diets too. And weight loss products that are a waste of money, a waste of people's time and energy, when they could be directing their energy towards something that's really going to make a difference. And just one other word, I'm going to say it again later, about, weight loss programs, they do have success, but can they maintain the weight loss? And that goes back to the set point theory. Very important to understand that and appreciate what it means. And now we'll turn to the clinical management of overweight and obesity. And I have the image of the Whitney Understanding Nutrition textbook. Much of what you saw, but not all of it, was from this book. And going forward, I have a lot more that's not from that source, but from a lot of professional societies and very up-to-date information to share with you. So, these are called the 4 pillars for managing overweight and obesity, meaning no one stands alone, that they rely on one another. Sometimes it's sequentially, but inevitably it's all 4. Physical activity alone, it's not going to help much for weight loss, but it maintains weight loss. Dietary counseling, behavioral support, medical therapies like weight loss drugs. There are 1 or 2 devices. I'm not going to be speaking about the devices too much, but there is one that's oral and people confuse it with a drug, but it's regulated as a device. It's a gel that expands and takes up space in the stomach. Avoiding obesogenic drugs, I added that one because that's part of the therapy, is to avoid things that are going to exacerbate body weight problems. And there is a role for bariatric surgery. Starting with eating patterns. Realistic goals. Be realistic about energy intake. And you want to avoid being highly restrictive and having rapid weight loss. So the goal, as you see in the middle of the slide, is to cut 500 to 750 kcals per day. So you're going to have adequate nutrition. And interestingly, breakfast frequency is inversely related to obesity. So it's good to have breakfast. There's been studies that have shown that. And the critical role of water. And when it's taken before meals, it may reduce the amount of food. So I mentioned adequacy, and if to pick a number, around 1,200 kilocalories a day, because below that you may get into the problem of developing deficiencies, and that creates its own medical problems. Eat small portions and slow down. And the keeping the energy-dense food, park it somewhere else. So I wanted to share this from the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, AACE. And this shows the four common diet plans. So there's well, actually it's three, excuse me. Plant-based diet, vegetarian-based, and vegan. And the items that at the intersection of all three of these common diets, shows you how fundamentally important they are in anybody's diet, whether you're normal weight or not. Fruits, nuts and seeds, grains and vegetables. Then, even in a plant-based diet, you supplement it with seafood and meats. And a vegetarian-based diet would supplement with dairy and eggs. So this simplifies a lot of information out there. It's a great graphic, and I wanted to share this. Moderate physical activity is sensible. And when you're adding it to activities that you must do to live. Those are called activities of daily living or of daily life, ADL. But the approach is you combine it with diet, and in that way you're more likely to lose more fat and retain lean muscle, very important, and less likely, as I said before, to gain back weight that you lost. So you can maintain weight loss better when you combine it with physical activity. And another bonus is reduction of abdominal fat. Now, I'm going back to that Department of Health and Human Services program called Move Your Way. I wanted you to take a look at the website, and maybe you can on your own. It's called an activity planner. And it says, make a plan to stay on track. Set your own weekly goals. Choose the activities you want. Get personalized tips and to help you stay motivated. And when you're done, you can print it out, share it with friends and family, because that's part of it. It's hard. Even in COVID, there were so many exercise classes online because it was important to be a shared experience. It's part of human nature. So they say set a goal for the week. And, you can start with a modest goal. Some options here, and you can see from these icons, there's really quite a range of activities that count. And you don't have to be a skateboarder. There's lots of activities of daily living, shoveling snow, for instance, that count towards this Move Your Way activity. So fundamental to any of these programs, this Move Your Way or any other, there's ones that you can purchase. It has to be realistic. So they call them SMART goals because it stands for, if you look at the bullets, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And here's an example of such a SMART goal. I will lose 10 pounds over the next 6 months and lower my blood pressure to the range advised by my healthcare team. Discretionary calories depends on how active we are. A sedentary person doesn't really have too many discretionary calories. As you look at the bar graph on the left, the difference is very small. So that person has to be more careful about how many calories they consume in a day. And the active person on the right, that red bar is much greater. So they have more. That's a bonus for being highly active. So this is pretty much the same material, so I won't go over it. But to an important position statement from the American Diabetes Association about physical activity / exercise. That's how they put it in their title back in 2016. And this is still active. This position statement is still an active position statement of the ADA. And I highlighted 3 of the very relevant recommendations. Exercise prescriptions can be written by physicians or a nurse practitioner, tailored to the individual based on the person's age and whatever complications. If they have arthritis, they could do maybe one exercise but not another. Maybe they could do a stationary bike more easily than some other exercises. To insert in a given day when somebody sits a lot, frequent intervals, or they call them short bouts of activity, burns more calories. It's a good, simple thing to do to get into the habit of. And of course, it has to be a lifelong lifestyle of physical activity. And these are just so sensible, but not so easy to implement. It takes a lot of determination and perseverance to do this over the long haul. But it pays dividends in the end by avoiding some diseases or delaying their progression. That's a huge benefit. So how is it helping in terms of like avoiding diabetes? Well, as muscles work, they need energy. They use what's called the glycogen, the stored glucose in the muscle. And while they're using that, the body is doing something in the background. It's moving the receptors for glucose from the inside of the muscle to the surface of the muscle. So what's traveling by in the blood circulation, the circulating blood glucose, gets taken up by the muscle, and then it's used as the muscle continues to work. So you can see this is how it results in lower blood glucose. This is great. You don't want to go too low, but this is very good to avoid hyperglycemia, as it's called. It also utilizes insulin more efficiently, because insulin also acts at the GLUT4 receptors to drive glucose into the cells. This is news. Exercise is the good news. Now, I'm going to point out that while the title in this next position statement, which is jointly issued by the American College of Sports Medicine and the American Diabetes Association, they use the word regular physical activity, that PA. That's what that is. If you combine it with modest weight loss, it lowers the risk of type 2 diabetes by 58% in those people who are in high-risk groups. This is phenomenal. To me, this should be the headlines in our newspapers because more people need to know about this. If I want to remind you of what those U.S. maps look like with the colors and how the time trend in obesity is accelerating. Well, that exactly mirrors what is happening to diabetes, type 2 diabetes in our country and worldwide. So physical activity is great when you combine it with modest weight loss through dietary plans. So what are some of the complications that we're trying to avoid by maintaining a reasonable body weight? Well, here's a list from a website that you might want to take a look at called rethinkobesity.com. And it's from one of the downloaded questionnaires called My Personal Weight Journey. So you could take a look at that list. And there's something you should know about called the obesity paradox, that sometimes being of normal body weight or under body weight isn't as helpful as somebody who has a little bit extra weight, as we might say. And this is probably due to fitness. So the take-home message is that being moderately fit doesn't mean you have to be an athlete, a competitive athlete. Being moderately fit is even more important than having a low BMI. course, it's good to also have a healthy BMI, but even if it isn't, moderate fitness is a very good predictor of health. So, in our clinical management, when do we think about drugs? And is it absolutely necessary? Well, anybody who knows nutrition knows that there's limitations to what people are willing to do or can feasibly do in their given lifestyle. So they often need a little help from another strategy. So we talked about physical activity. We talked about diet planning, meal planning. Now, whether or not you need drugs is going to depend, on the degree of obesity and your risk for getting obesity-related diseases, the adiposity-related diseases. So in those cases, you should consider drugs as part of the long term, and it can assist with modest weight loss. It's not a miracle. There's no miracle drug, although they're getting better. We'll get to that on 2 slides. Next following slide. So what we've had, it's been slow to come up with anything that for medication. The first one was orlistat, which decreases fat absorption. And it's available without a prescription. That's what the OTC stands for, over the counter, and one trade name, Ali, and then a double that dose as a prescription only medication called Xenical. But in the last decade, we've fortunately have some diabetes medications that can also produce weight loss, to the point where one company decided, well, let's develop this for weight loss and not just for diabetes, and hence liraglutide, which is a higher dose of the diabetes medication. And unfortunately, it's an injectable. It's subcutaneous, so the person can administer it themselves. It's daily subcutaneous. But now we have a semaglutide. You've probably seen the commercials if you watch television, and that's in an oral tablet, so it's much more convenient. And these are going to be major pillars of managing overweight and obesity. Now, this is the list of the prescription drugs that have a labeled indication for weight management, for long-term weight management, not the short-term amphetamine-like drugs. And historically, as you see in this table, there's been a lot of effort to develop medications to treat obesity, and really haven't worked out well. A lot of them, some of them were removed even before they were marketed, and some had too many serious side effects and are banned in certain countries. But I wanted you to appreciate that there's been great effort towards getting drugs that work. And now we have, because we have enough, so you have in this what's called an algorithm. How do you make decisions about when to start? How do you know it's working? Do you continue with it? Do you stop and try something else? So, the first box in this algorithm for using the newer anti-obesity agents says assess risk-benefit. So notice that it says if the BMI is at least 27, that it's not even obese. That's modest obesity, overweight rather. But if they also have 2 comorbid conditions, then we do think about drugs. So this has changed, and just very recently. Or if the BMI is definitely for adults, definitely in the obese category of 30 or greater for a BMI, 30 kilograms per meter squared. So this is when, yes, we should think about, consider one of these agents. There's 4 of them listed. And the next, the third tier of, or row rather, says, well, what is the criteria to lose X amount of weight by 4 months or 3 months? And it depends on the drug. They're just slightly different. That's why I'm not going to read it off. It does depend on the drug and how their product labeling specifies it. And then they say, yes, continue, or no. You may need to taper it, or you don't need to taper it. It means to slowly discontinue it and try something else. Now, I haven't read, the initial goal is to lose 3 to 5%. You see that's what they are. That's awfully small percentage of your total body weight. So these drugs, they're not miracle drugs. This is initially in the first well, they say the first 3 months, but now many clinicians in bariatric medicine are saying, don't wait that long. Assess at the first month and make a decision, because there's too much at stake. People's health is at stake with all these adiposity based medical conditions that develop, and once it's very hard to reverse them once they develop. A note about surgery: it is not considered as aggressive as it once was, and it has its role. Definitely has its role as in addition to the other 4 pillars. And we're finding that, so it's not just for the severe obesity, but for moderate obesity with risk factors. What it does is it reduces the capacity of the stomach, which, remember the ghrelin? Where is it produced? In the cells of the stomach. So there's less ghrelin as well. So it's a hormonal effect. And remarkably, there's long-term health benefits where they've seen remission of diabetes, especially in adolescents. So young people who have undergone this surgery, their type 2 diabetes reversed, or at least remitted, which means it's steady. And it's important to know that dietary supplements, very specific ones, are absolutely essential after these bariatric surgeries, because nutritional deficiencies can lead to serious medical problems themselves. The picture shows the different surgeries over the years, and they all are still used to some extent, but the most popular one is sleeve gastrectomy. It's basically making a tube out of the stomach instead of being a pouch, so it has less capacity and it's easier to feel satiated. So that's the end of our clinical management. I did want to come back to the children and adolescents and say a few words. Just that the growth charts are, there's ones for boys and girls, and so there's an example in chapter 16 that shows the growth charts and how to read them. So this is an example. So the things to note, that the green is the healthy weight. This is for age 2 to 20 on the bottom, age 2 to 20, and the low end. So the low end, normally there's a dip in the toddlers because the appetite slows and they're growing, so there's linear growth. So that's why there's a dip normally. If there isn't, when they go to the pediatrician and they're plotting these over every visit and they don't see that dip, and there's other problems that the child is having, like cognitive impairment and some kind of problem with an organ like the heart, for instance, they have to think about, well, is this obesity a part of a syndrome, a genetic syndrome? These are very, very rare and very unfortunate because there's very few options for these individuals. On the other end, the adolescents, because this is a child's growth chart. It's important to continue to monitor these growth charts right into late adolescence, because when their adolescents have obesity, it's more likely it will persist into their adulthood. Furthermore, obesity it usually means an earlier puberty. And this is an example of if you ever had to actually figure out, well, what category is this patient in? Well, here in this chart, the blue represents normal body weight. So that's somewhere between the 10th and the 85th percentile. And lower than that, in the green, represents being underweight. You could see, only about 2% of children are underweight. So we're not going to really talk about it because it's not a big health issue, and it's clearer what the treatment would be. Above the blue is overweight, and then the orange is the obese. So if you look at the box at the bottom, it says, what if you had a boy who was 13 years old and had a BMI of 24? Is this patient normal body weight, overweight, underweight? So you look first at the age, 13 on the x-axis, and then you look at the y-axis for the BMI of 24, and you see the red lines where they intersect. They intersect in the yellow region of overweight. So that's how to use a chart if you needed to do it. And there are other charts because of severe obesity. I told you early on in this lecture, pretty common now. It's the fastest growing subgroup in pediatric obesity is severe. And they have the separate growth charts where there's, class 1 is over the 95th percentile. Class 2 severe obesity is over 120 percentile, and then even a class 3. So one slide on what are the recommendations for children. Well, it's not markedly different from adults, but these are awfully important because it forms habits. Having a variety of foods, maintaining a healthy weight, limiting fat and cholesterol, moderation, and avoiding extremes, so you don't want them to deprive themselves. They need nutrients for their normal development and growth. And they do consider drugs, but it's always diet. They do as much as you can with meal planning first. And so I'm just going to remind you, closing, these critical thinking questions that you can review and ask yourself. And with that, I will say thank you very much for your attention. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share what I've learned in the last few years about overweight and obesity, a really critical medical issue in America right now with the pandemic. Thank you.